Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. I'm Dwayne Schultes, and today I'm joined by my good friend, Steve Potts, who's now no longer the head of the stealth company, Biotech. You're now the CEO of the officially brought to the world breakthrough medicine. Congratulations on your Series A, Steve.
Thanks, Dwayne. It's nice to be just continuing the process.
So we're here at ASCO. Obviously, you raised $60 million. Again, it's amazing in a Series A. How difficult has it been?
I mean, it's a great time for biotech, and there's even at this conference, some great news. I mean, there's some incredible things coming along for patients. I mean, we are all in the biotech community really happy this year with what's happening, with the financings that are happening, with some of the transactions. It's a good time for the industry, but it is still hard to get financed. It did not just happen easily. There's a lot of good ideas out there that are still not getting financed, especially the early stage work. People that are building early stage platforms. There's still a lot of money going to clinical assets. Like anything, getting a lot of gas in the tank is never easy. You have to really have a good team, a good plan, and the right things to come together. Very excited to be funded and to be moving things forward, but I don't think people should underestimate the headwinds that we do have. So you see some great clinical assets. Those have taken years to really come to fruition. While we are pretty excited about the state of the industry and what it's going to do for patients, I think there is still a reminder that all of these assets took a long time to get there, years, sometimes a decade or more. So early stage is still tough getting funded. And then, of course, with the challenges with the government funding, the university type funding, that makes it even harder on the earlier stage companies.
So we have a tradition now. I guess we meet at ASCO and
Yes.
Bio and grouse about how terrible things are. Last year we were very concerned about the state of small molecules and research. We just released a study that shows unequivocally a 27% drop in lead asset small molecule oncology, late stage.
27% drop in
lead assets,
small late stage oncology. Yeah, that fits.
Yeah, and because there's 4.7 follow-on studies per asset, that axiomatically leads to what we're seeing, a 35% drop in follow-on research, also in small molecule oncology.
And a bigger hit on small molecules, NDA path and the BLA path.
It's the only place we really see strict statistical significance aside from orphans and orphan oncology, which doesn't come as a shock. Are you seeing a different vibe here at ASCO? Because that's what we're seeing in the data. Are you seeing a higher prevalence of antibody drug conjugates and radiotheranostics, things like that? Is this what you're seeing?
You've got to look at the data very carefully through a couple different lenses. One is, are the early stage first in human programs getting hurt? Are the follow-on later stages, are the money going to more approvable, like phase 3 type designs getting cut back? And then how much of that is NDA path? How much of that is BLAs? I mean, absolutely, since the IRA, there was a huge shift to all the BLA path drugs, bispecifics, and some of that was success. They're great drugs too.
Right.
But it was historically, instead of for every 2 NDA path programs in oncology, there was 1 BLA path. It really flipped
around.
Somewhere around that. So that's continuing. There's still a lot of antibody drug conjugates. There's a lot of bispecifics. Radiotherapeuticals are still actually, they're either one. If you put a small molecule and then have the radio ligand on it, it's an NDA path. If you put an antibody in the regular ligand, it's a BLA. So even this is you can't just say radiopharmaceuticals, and even that is divided in 2. But there too, you see a shift more toward antibodies. And of course, I think of this just as a cancer analogy. We ran an open label study with 2 arms in 2023, and one arm was NDA path drugs, and one arm was BLA path drugs, right? And we asked, are investors going to pay attention to 9 versus 13? Investors they're very smart, they're very sophisticated, and they are not going to fund a 9-year versus 13. So you saw an absolute drop. So we ran that study, we have that data set, and that data set now for me is applicable anywhere we talk about encroachment of patent life. Now it might have an MFN guise, it might have a IRA guise, because patent life is complicated and you can frame it a lot of different ways. At the end of the day, we now have a data set in the industry of this design study that we ran, which is NDA path versus BLA path, and we have the data to say that 9 years of basically, in essence, patent protection is not enough. It's not enough. And so you can use that data set. So that story is still playing out. Now, there's some subtlety here at ASCO because you had incredible data that a standing ovation, the molecular glues program from Revolution Medicines. that is a small molecule. So you think everything's healthy. But I think we are seeing a consolidation of the different MOAs in small molecules. You see a lot of companies doing KRAS drugs, follow-ons. But so while you might say, well, small molecules are healthy, what's been the problem? Where did that come from? And, that program, the excitement of that particular small molecule actually started, it was Warp Drive Bio. A Third Rock started that company in 2012. And then about 2016, Alan Rigby, Mark Mulvihill, and team came in and did this just awesome molecular glues approach. And so from 10 years till about 6 years ago, those glues were designed. Revolution Medicines then acquired that company around 2018 and did a great job getting those molecules into the clinic. So you got to be careful with how you see things.
And what's interesting is if you look at a lot of the rhetoric, particularly before the IRA, when I was being brought in by Jody Arrington and Congressman Burgess to argue with the CBO about this, the general feeling was, well, late stage, it's not going to get touched. No one's going to pull back once they've done this. And that 27% number, we weren't expecting that number to jump out in the data. Now, again, that means roughly 75, 3/4 are still being pushed through, but there is that quarter drop. So someone is willing to take a big hit when they've put 750 million or $1 billion on the table already to kind of go, maybe not, and they're willing to walk away. Again, yes, 3/4 still come through, but we are losing a quarter. So what's really interesting is there was this rhetoric that after IRA passed, there'd be this big rebound and everything would come to normal. In actual fact, last year, 2025, was the second lowest year for small molecule oncology in the entire cohort after IRA passed. I mean,
really?
It was the second lowest.
I think that makes sense. Again, if you filter out some of the outliers, which the R&D investment had started years earlier, I think we're seeing that same trend.
Is that weighing on some of your investments?
We think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, our large pharma will be the ones that take this and finish the commercialization job and get this to patients. And so, of course, they're thinking about it. We think about it. What's interesting is I have very current data because we have small molecule programs and we have antibody drug conjugate type programs as well. So we do have NDA path and BLA path, and I can compare the manufacturing costs. I can think about the risks differences if there are. I can think about the patent life. You can do projections.
Are we going to start making decisions, economic decisions, where this would be better as a small molecule, but bloody hell, I'd rather pivot this to a BLA?
We already are doing it. It happened almost instantly. You think about some public examples. I mean, Pfizer bought Array. Array has had some incredible drugs. I mean, we competed with one, the Loxo drug, years ago, and there's a number of drugs out of there, but they've really tapered back that investment and instead, bought Seattle Genetics, which is antibody drug conjugate. So absolutely, across the industry, we're thinking about these things.
There's often a belief that regulation sort of lives in a separate world and it doesn't actually impact the real world decisions that you guys are making here. It's sort of like make-believe or Valhalla or some fictitious Brigadoon that only shows up once every 7 years or something.
I used to think that until I couldn't get a small molecule company funded because of IRA.
Okay.
So yes, I used to think that too.
Okay, so we do have now maybe the one small caveat of success was under the big beautiful bill passed July 4th of last year, 2025, there is the Orphan Cures Act.
Yes.
Now, that from our data, knowing how you're not going to go compete with a large indication, what's the point? You're going to be looking for areas of high unmet medical need. I mean, often these are late stage orphan treatment categories. How important has been the Orphan Cures Act for you?
I'm really grateful that was passed. It was included in the budget. It was one step. And I think all of us knew there was the bigger bite of the apple, the thing that really needed to be done and still needs to be done is Epic.
Yeah.
And Epic, rationalizes 913 and makes it 1313. That's what needs to be done. That's a hard change, though. And so Orphan was the other approach, which is basically instead of just one exception on Orphan, you can have multiple exceptions. It's still not fixing the root problem, which is let's do 1313, and we know that those numbers will allow investors to get their return. And importantly, it will still allow drugs to be priced in a generic equivalent or biosimilars type fashion in a timely fashion. So that 1313 is still the right answer.
The problem is the CBO came back for the costing of the Orphan Cures. Came in July. I highly doubt in our study we're getting those tail impacts. I don't see it impacting our numbers. So the positive impacts of Orphan Cures will only start showing up in the data now in 2026. the CBO basically said, yeah, this is going to be 50, 60% higher now than we initially estimated. And now you have a bunch of congressmen trying to push through legislation to unwind that. What happens at that point?
Really what this is a lineup of pharmaceutical products to ultimately have, massive price fixing at 13 years. And so I think of it more like what you've done is you've pushed all the small molecule programs into the front of the line. As an amateur here, I would say I think what's happening is you're seeing them saying, hey, look at all this costing of these small molecule programs that are not at the front of the line. But what they haven't said is, well, what about all the biologics that will move up and be there instead? And so CBO is saying, wow, we are not saving as much money as we thought we would on small molecules in this first 9 to 13 or orphan classification. But what they're not saying is, well, what about all the BLA type programs that would be in that cost cutting? So it's really just moving around which program is going to get cut first.
What was interesting when you look at the numbers in the study we did, particularly the early one that we did some work on, where we looked at the early stage IRA impacts of the VCs, angels, you could really model that by exposure to Medicare. So some of the VCs were being pretty smart and pretty sensitive. As the Brits would say, they were boxing clever around, okay, this is a lung cancer, this hits at 45, we'll do that. This is prostate, don't want to touch that.
Most of these cancers are really hard to chop and say, well, this is a Medicare population and this is sooner, because you have a bell curve and cancer is ultimately a disease of the aging. But I think where you see more of that is in some of the other areas outside of oncology. Like, there's a big acquisition of a small molecule company in the mental health area. And a lot of people email and say, see, nothing's wrong. Look, a small molecule company got acquired for a lot of money. Everything's great. But what you see is that indication was a younger population mental health area. It was not
depression's an 18-year-old female. Schizophrenia is a 24-year-old
male.
So
it was absolutely it wasn't affected by the to the Medicare population. So it really just illustrated the point rather than it being an example against it. So all these things are so interesting, but at the end of the day, investors are going to invest in things where they are not being arbitrarily cut off for being able to price how the drug ought to be priced.
We also now have most favored nations, which is another whiz-bang model that's going to be coming out, where essentially Europe has been giving higher discounts, some confidential, some not, some in clawbacks after sale. Oh, we went over budget. We get to pull back 3 or 4% on the back end, which is really great for hard budgeting for companies. So Europe has been 60, 70%-ish lower in their net prices that they get at, the pharmacy in the hospital in Europe compared to the U.S. And there's now this political movement around that this is tremendously unfair. The Americans are getting the bad raw deal here. So whatever price you're selling, and I'm picking on Europe, it's Australia, Canada, Japan as well, the OECD basket of countries. If you price that low, you're going to have to put that price in the U.S. where there's a government program. What do you think is going to happen from most favored nation?
We are absolutely carrying the burden of the payment for the entire world for cancer drug development. Not one time when I talk to an investor do I even talk about the European market, the Japanese market,
so
the Chinese market.
You don't even look at those foreign
We
markets.
Look at the number of American patients and the price per patient, because that's the only place we can get the return on the money. Now, that's great if you're in Europe. Americans cover the cost of drug development. And I do applaud the administration for saying this is not right. You need to do something here. But the reality is you're not going to have the Europeans just stay up and great. Well, let's take a chunk of our budget and start paying more for these drugs. But you are seeing this also because the Europeans, the typical European gets a new drug. Look at the Revolution Medicines drugs and just watch how long it's going to take for the Europeans to get those versus the pancreatic patients, how long it's going to take. But it's 2-3 years later at least on average.
And it's getting longer.
It's probably getting longer. Why would you be in a hurry to give away a drug in Europe when then you're going to get beat up by the price differential with the U.S.?
You're seeing companies now actually pulling controversial drugs out of Europe countries. You're having one company now going to antitrust because they want to withdraw. And
this is why we do Europe for clinical trials, because frankly, like in the UK, they cannot get access to new medicines, so they're so anxious to get on these trials. I can say that from multiple countries where there's not access to standard of care, approved drugs that Americans are getting, so then they're excited to be on a trial so they can get access to at least the MOA of an unproven earlier agent. You see that exactly in the interest in clinical trials and access to new medicines through clinical trials, which ultimately, again, industry pays for.
So let's say you're successful. You get a phase 3. You decide not to mortgage yourself off. You actually IPO. And you have the option to go to Europe. Would you just avoid Europe if it's going to kick you in the teeth on pricing in the U.S.?
But it's country by country, too.
Right.
You gotta think about that. And then there's the countries that are outside the EU, like Switzerland. There's the Eastern Bloc. Even Europe you got to have a lot of team. You got to have a lot of investment in that. And I watch my fellow CEOs that are further along struggle with this. Imagine if you're a European car manufacturer and they're saying if you sell an American car, you're going to be dinged by the price you're going to pay in Germany. I mean, you are going to think really, really hard before whether you would sell into the American market. So absolutely. But all this is just, again, be careful when the government steps in and makes these kinds of pricing decisions and I mean, what other industry is saying, let's do this? It's going to have all kinds of just crazy things we did not expect, and most of it adverse.
So Steve Usden yesterday published an article on BioCentury, now looking more back to the front end, the area that you regularly play. We've seen enormous cuts in NIH funding. We've seen enormous issues with restructuring of FDA with varying reports of success and or failure. Now we've seen a proposal coming out of CMS relating to the Office of Management and Budget, where they're at least proposing to remove peer review and have oversight of that not be by medical experts or subject matter experts, but by politicians. So this is going to require a government level cabinet type approval. How does that strike you as someone who's now working with an asset that came out of a university? And again, let's be clear. You couldn't prescribe that drug that came out of the university. It's not a drug. It's a proof of concept. What's going to happen if now you got a government bureaucrat standing there with a red ink and a big pad that says no?
All of our drugs are breakthrough invented in-house, but most of the industry in early stage is licensing right out of the university. And even if you're not, you benefit in a 1,000 ways from, my team has an incredible academic background from, some of the top universities in the country, and that's all paid for by the universities. So there's always this symbiotic relationship between academia and industry, and always will be. But that ruling, as I digest it, it's catastrophic. I hope everybody that works in pharma, whether it's the CEO of Amgen, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, or small biotechs like me, or employees that work in this industry, realize this is not a good legislative approach. Talk to your legislators. They want to talk to you. They want to hear from you. But explain to them how dangerous this is right now, because you absolutely do not want to see a political decision maker on a grant scored project. Read the legislation, and don't just read the first two lines. Sound great. They really they do. I was like, first I'm like, what's the problem? Read the first two lines and then maybe put it into AI if you don't have time, but just say, what's the ultimate result? And what it is, it really is, Dwayne, like you said, it is basically, it's going to be political decision making on prioritizing of grants, and it is just not what we want. It is hard enough to win a grant. These people work really hard. You shouldn't have your grant stopped right in the middle of it because your political views don't align. What we want is to not have political factors in how a grant is scored. It's crazy. I think we have till July to comment on it. Yeah. So we have a couple months.
A lot of this appears to be blowback due to the ham-fisted nature of what happened during COVID.
Yeah, I see that. And even in the vaccine things, I think you have to pause and say, why do you see this anger at Washington? Why do you see the anger at the NIH, the FDA, the vaccines? I'm learning to listen first and understand, how are people feeling about that? What happened there? What can we learn from it? And then can we not write legislation that just basically is going to make things worse, but in the other direction?
Yeah, and obviously you're in Arizona, which has a strong libertarian
Absolutely,
streak,
yeah.
Which those are my sentiments. Anyone who knows me knows I may be the most libertarian person still alive in the United States.
You're a pro-science vaccine libertarian person, and I respect that.
But it does seem like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I'm very involved in Arizona with helping to be a very pro-science, pro-business, and keep that environment going. And both sides of the aisle have done a great job of really making sure Arizona is one of the most pro-business, pro-science friendly states. But we are certainly fighting this libertarian, look, my rights were taken away. They made me wear a mask. They made me get vaccination. I do not want to see this again. So, for example, there is a bill, if it comes up, it would basically say, government can do nothing to force me to take a vaccine, to wear a mask, etc. And that actually sounds okay with a libertarian hat on. And I can see why someone would think that based on their experience, during COVID. But the challenge is that there's been 4 studies of looking at if you just change the wording in vaccination from required to recommended, just one R to another R, required to recommended, 4 different studies, that it shows that the percentage of people that will actually take the vaccine drops from in the 90s, which is what you need for herd immunity, down into the 80s. And so, and in Arizona, we have all these exclusions already that no one really can force you to take any vaccine. There's a lot of exclusions for multiple things. So it's already on the books. But just changing that from required to recommended does make people that are busy just say, okay, well, it's just recommended. Maybe I'll wait. And, so then you have kind of a small percentage that are going to get these diseases, and you're going to see some really awful things as a result. So even there, too, it's like you can't just read the headline that just says, hey, we think it's bad that, the government should not require you to wear a mask. The government has no right to say, you have to stay home from school if we have a measles outbreak. It sounds good, but then when you look at the details and you start thinking about it, you look at the work that's been done by really good vaccine researchers, you can see, that there's more to it than that. So, yeah, Dwayne, I don't want to see an overreach, but we are seeing that. And it's not just Arizona, it's across the country. You're seeing a real blowback from some of what is conceived as a very, very heavy hand during the COVID era.
What about China? All of this seems to create enormous barriers to what has been global leading science. At a certain point, are you concerned that we're incentivizing a decline in U.S. biopharma leadership, much like Europe has done with very heavy-handed policies after they put in the centralized procedure and it went from scientists to policymakers and bureaucrats making decisions?
If we, become a nation that is afraid of science or accepts pseudoscience, it won't just be China, it'll be everywhere. And it goes slowly. I started my career in 2000. At that time, it was about half of the work we would do with collaborators was in Europe. Europe was a real leader. Yeah. In so many pharmas, it was like half the time in Europe, half the time in the U.S. And now it's, we spend 95% of our time in the U.S. So that took a long time to see that kind of decline. And I think it won't be tomorrow, but you'll just see a gradual decline for all of these things, which are ultimately just headwinds. We are encouraging leaders, whether you're CEO level or executive level, to really speak out on policy. Well, it's one thing to ask somebody to do it. It's another thing to really feel comfortable doing it. So we are doing a series of training sessions specifically for busy biotech CEOs to get good on just one topic. Just pick one area where you're comfortable and can really speak well to the American living room. And so I've learned how to do this for the last 3 or 4 years. And so we're just taking some of that and basically turning it into a really nice training module. So there'll be some more information. This is in partnership with No Patient Left Behind. I think it'll be really helpful as a first step for a number of us that are just really busy. And the only reason we would even do policy is because it has such an impact in us getting proper funding and properly able to develop the drugs we need to develop.
Steve, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for your time, and congratulations again on Breakthrough Medicine. That's fantastic. It's amazing you're able to do this with everything we're talking about, and I wish you all success, sir.
Thank you.
The executive producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Editing by Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation LLC, copyright 2026.